tardes. Muchas gracias a todos por estar aquí. Vamos a intentar ser puntuales. Tenemos una tarde muy interesante con la presentación del Bertelsmann Transformation Index de nuestros compañeros Sabine Donner y el señor Hauptmann. En primer lugar, nos gustaría tomar la palabra la señora Clara Barsols, la directora de la Fundación Bertelsmann. Clara, cuando quieras.
Buenas tardes a todos y bienvenidos al espacio Bertelsmann. Es un placer para mí saludar a tantísimas personas de instituciones reconocidas, algunos representantes gubernamentales, de organismos internacionales, de agencias de cooperación, ministerios, de think tanks, universidades y estudiantes, apreciadas autoridades, queridos amigos. Como sabéis, nuestra matriz, la Bertelsmann Stiftung, ha estado 2 años elaborando el presente informe del Bertelsmann Transformation Index, en el que han colaborado 300 personas y en la que se recogen los datos y se analizan el estado de la democracia en 137 países. Este informe lleva elaborándose de forma ininterrumpida desde el 2006 y hoy nuestros compañeros Hauke Hartmann y Sabine Donner van a presentarnos los resultados, sobre todo enfocados a los países de Latinoamérica. Y con ello podremos ver una radiografía real de cómo está la situación en estos países y también cuál ha sido la evolución histórica. Y estoy convencida de que esta radiografía, que nos da una información con datos empíricos a través de muchísimos indicadores, por supuesto tenéis a vuestra disposición el informe entero, es seguramente muy útil para muchas de las instituciones que estáis aquí. It was 2022 when the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz used the term Zeitenwende to refer to the change of time and especially to the war with Russia. And since then, Zeitenwende has been used increasingly to name the time we are living of such rapid changes. And this is also what the Bertelsmann Transformation Index shows. It shows that we are in a time with very rapid changes. It also shows that the democracy is getting less in most countries and that they are becoming less successful, and also that the scores are the lowest from the 20 years there has been this report. And I would just like to thank, first of all, Hauke Hartmann and Sabine Donner for elaborating this very, very impressive work and for their generosity to coming to Madrid and presenting it to us. Thank you very much. Also to Carlos Malamud, who is expert in el Real Instituto Elcano and who is a reference in Latin American trends. To Diego López Garrido, who is the director of Fundación Alternativas and who is the former Secretary of State for the European Union. He will be our keynote speaker today. And of course, Charles Powell, the director of Real Instituto Elcano, without whom this event could not have taken place. And of course, to all of you that are here today, I hope really that this event will be very interesting for all of you and that it will be also that the report will be useful for your work. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Clara, for your words. Now I'd like to give the floor to Charles Power, Director of Real Instituto Elcano. Mr. Powell, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, it's a great pleasure and an honor for me to be here today representing the Elcano Royal Institute. Thank you very much, Clara, for your kind words. We greatly enjoy collaborating with the Bertelsmann Foundation. I was in your premises in Washington recently. We are active members, for example, of an initiative called the Transatlantic Periscope, which is run out of the Washington office. and it's always a joy to be in this room, which is actually one of our favorite venues here in Madrid. So thank you very much for your hospitality. And it's great to see so many of you here, the authors of this incredibly interesting report, my dear friend and colleague Diego López Garrido, Carlos Malamud, and so many others. I'm going to be very brief. One of the reasons why I was particularly interested in this report is that, as some of you may know, back in July, the Elcano Royal Institute, we were discussing this earlier, published a report called Why Latin America Matters. It's a bit sad that we still have to explain to people why Latin America matters, frankly. I find it a bit depressing, but there you are. And the purpose of this report, of our report, was essentially to question some of the stereotypes that are out there, that are very prevalent in the media, possibly in political circles, financial circles. And we particularly questioned three things, and I very much enjoyed reading your report because I think it complements ours. Perhaps we were more optimistic, perhaps even slightly naive on occasion, but we wanted to challenge three ideas. The first idea is that Latin America is an economic disaster. It is not. Again, if we compare Latin America, and let me stress this, if we compare Latin America with the other emerging regions of the world, it is actually doing quite well. And I was very pleased to see that this report also stresses that. It stresses, for example, the fact that monetary and currency policies have been implemented in many Latin American countries very successfully, in particular thanks to something which is often overlooked, and that is the quality of many Latin American central banks. And this, I think, speaks to the solidity and sophistication of many Latin American institutions, which isn't always acknowledged. The second stereotype that we challenge is the idea that Latin America is a political basket case, political ground zero, where everything is going wrong, you have dictatorships and coups and guerrillas and so on. Well, again, although democracy is coming under stress everywhere in the world, including, of course, in Europe, by and large, and again, by comparison with most emerging regions, and this is something that your report also acknowledges, democracy and the rule of law are doing better in Latin America than in most emerging regions elsewhere. We don't want to idealize this, we don't want to whitewash the problems, we don't want to ignore the obvious challenges that many Latin American democracies face, but we do want to stress, I think, that this is actually common to many of our countries today, sadly. The third stereotype we challenge is perhaps less relevant to this report, but I think it's worth mentioning, and that is the idea that we Europeans have become irrelevant in Latin America. This is not true. And of course, the corollary of this is that China has taken over effectively. This is simply not true. Latin America is still heavily intertwined, very densely intertwined with our European economies and, of course, with the US economy. And by and large, I think what our report mainly wanted to stress, and this is also very present in this wonderful report by the Bertelsmann Foundation, is the idea that most Latin Americans actually share our values and interests. Latin America is not alien to us. The Spanish Minister of Foreign Affairs likes to say that Latin America is the most Euro-compatible region in the world. I find that a bit patronizing, to be honest with you, but I get the gist of what he's trying to say. We feel at home in Latin America. Latin Americans feel at home here. We fundamentally share the same values and interests. And that is why I think today's exercise is so interesting. So let me just thank you, the authors, for having produced this very interesting report. It's very subtle, it's very nuanced, it's very well argued, and I think I would probably agree with at least 90% of its conclusions. So I strongly urge you all to read it, to study it carefully, and if you have the time and the inclination, to compare it to our own report, because ultimately the conclusion is the same. Latin America matters. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Mr. Powell, for your thought-provoking speech. Now I would like to give the floor to Mr. Diego López Garrido, who will be the keynote speaker, who will be illuminating us with a lot of information on the democracies of the world. Mr. López Garrido, you have the floor. Thank you.
Gracias a todos. Muchas gracias a Bertelsmann, la Fundación, por la invitación a impartir, por así decirlo, como keynote speaker esta tarde. Enhorabuena a la Fundación Elcano, al Real Instituto Elcano y a Bertelsmann por esta iniciativa sobre la democracia, que es, y yo arrancaría mi intervención de esta manera, que es la esencia de Europa. La democracia es la realidad más esencial que define a Europa. Y esa es la perspectiva desde la cual yo voy a abordar lo que es el contenido de este estudio sobre la democracia y la evolución de las democracias. Una perspectiva, por tanto, desde los valores de la Unión Europea, de los valores europeos, que son esencialmente tres: la democracia en sentido estricto, los derechos y libertades y el rule of law. Eso es fundamentalmente la forma en la que vemos el mundo y lo valoramos, lo evaluamos en función de que se acerquen más o menos el resto de los países del mundo a esos valores. Y hay que decir que en los últimos tiempos la visión de las democracias en el mundo no es especialmente optimista. Precisamente el estudio que hoy se presenta, de Bertelsmann, otros como el que hace The Economist Intelligence Index, coinciden en que en los últimos 20 años solamente podemos decir que hay 63 países en el mundo a los que se le pueda llamar democracia. Yo aportaría incluso algo más. El año 2022, el report of the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance señala que en los últimos 6 años el número de países que se han movido hacia el autoritarismo es más del doble de los que se han movido hacia la democracia. Eso es lo que ha pasado, desgraciadamente, en los últimos 6 años. No sé si es a eso a lo que se refería recientemente Emmanuel Macron, que siempre es muy activo inventando denominaciones o nueva época o cosas así, pero Macron hablaba de una decivilización. Estaríamos asistiendo a una decivilización. Bueno, no sé si se refería exactamente a esto, pero la verdad es que por primera vez en décadas hay que admitir que hay más dictaduras que democracias y que el 72% de los habitantes del planeta viven en autocracias. Esa es la situación que nos encontramos en estos momentos. Pero ¿qué entendemos por democracia? ¿Cómo denominamos a algún país democracia o no? Bueno, yo creo que fundamentalmente, sobre la base de esos 3 conceptos que yo señalaba anteriormente, para empezar, una democracia es un lugar donde hay procesos electorales plurales, procesos electorales universales, en donde hay partidos políticos libres, en donde hay campañas electorales libres, y eso es una primera cuestión muy importante, muy relevante para denominar a algo, a un país, a un sistema como una democracia. Pero además de eso, en una democracia en sentido amplio, en una democracia hay una alta participación política. La sociedad civil tiene una cultura de participación política. Hay libre manifestación, movilizaciones, y no hay discriminación al respecto por la raza o por el credo. Eso es una parte importante de la democracia. La cultura política es del pueblo, de los pueblos en una democracia, supone que hay un consenso en las virtudes de la democracia, que hay una separación, por tanto, de Iglesia y de Estado, y que hay libertades civiles, por ejemplo, la libertad de expresión y la libertad de información, a lo que luego me referiré. Por ejemplo, en donde hay acceso a Internet. Hoy se podría decir que un país donde no haya acceso a Internet no es una democracia. Forma parte, sin duda, en el escenario actual del acceso a la democracia. En donde hay derechos y libertades y que no se limitan solo a las libertades clásicas de la libertad de reunión o de asociación o el derecho a la integridad física, sino que debe ampliarse a derechos sociales, entendiendo también a estos como derechos humanos. Si me permiten un spot publicitario, hace unos días presentaba en el Congreso de los Diputados un libro que he coordinado con la autoría de otras personas, presentábamos, que se llama Los nuevos derechos sociales fundamentales. Es algo que hemos lanzado, hemos publicado la Fundación Alternativas junto con el Centro de Estudios Políticos y Constitucionales, lo presentamos en el Congreso, y se trata de decir el derecho a la salud, el derecho al medio ambiente, el derecho a tener pensiones, el derecho a la vivienda, de donde tanto se está hablando en estos momentos en España sobre el tema del derecho a la vivienda. Esos son derechos fundamentales, pero en la Constitución española no están así. En la Constitución española están como inspiradores, principios inspiradores. Por eso hemos propuesto en esa publicación, hemos propuesto a los grupos parlamentarios una reforma constitucional para que esos derechos sean derechos fundamentales, porque eso profundizará en el sentido democrático del Estado español. Así que estos son aspectos importantes de lo que es una democracia. Y yo quisiera, para ir terminando, yo quisiera hablar de un par de enemigos que tiene la democracia en este momento. Uno de ellos es el populismo. El populismo es un enemigo, sin duda, de la democracia. En una reciente publicación editada por la Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, se habla de Eva Illouz, habla de fascismo y democracia, el gusano en la manzana. Y se refiere al populismo con las palabras de los politólogos Stephen Levitsky y Daniel Ziblatt. Dicen que las democracias no mueren solo mediante golpes militares u otros acontecimientos así de dramáticos. También mueren lentamente, y el populismo es una de las formas políticas que adopta esa muerte lenta. El populismo no es fascismo per se, sino más bien una tendencia fascista, una línea de fuerza que pone presión en el campo político y lo empuja hacia tendencias regresivas y predisposiciones antidemocráticas. Hay muchas investigaciones que han tratado de explicar el por qué surge esta especie de populismo que tiene una cierta relación con lo que en su momento fue el fascismo, con esos valores culturales, tiene que ver también con la transformación de los medios de comunicación, que en muchos países se han consolidado y comprado con la intención de cambiar la agenda liberal de la prensa dominante. Y tenemos el caso, por ejemplo, del empresario multimillonario en Francia, Vincent Bolloré, o el ejemplo del multimillonario estadounidense de origen australiano, Rupert Murdoch. Bueno, esto es una forma de controlar la información y es un elemento importante que explica eso que se ha llamado el populismo. El otro enemigo, bueno, la democracia tiene muchos enemigos, pero el otro enemigo importante de la democracia en los tiempos modernos es la desinformación. Y quisiera referirme algo a la desinformación, que es un concepto complejo de definir. Por ejemplo, el grupo de alto nivel de la Comisión Europea lo considera como una información manifiestamente falsa que trata de inducir a error y producir daño. Así lo define el grupo de alto nivel de la Comisión Europea a la desinformación. Y en un estudio del Parlamento Europeo, la otra gran institución de la Unión Europea, considera la desinformación como algo manipulado, información manipulada que intenta vulnerar o que va en contra del interés público, que es hostil hacia el poder público, hacia el interés público y hacia los procesos democráticos, que es hostil a la democracia y que utiliza unas determinadas técnicas de difusión, recientemente la inteligencia artificial, que es un elemento que utiliza la desinformación. De verdad, esto debería estar en el Código Penal. Pero estos actos graves de desinformación no están en el Código Penal. Curiosamente, no están en el Código Penal, a pesar de lo malvado que es y los efectos dañinos que tiene la desinformación contra la idea de democracia, contra la democracia. Es uno de los elementos que explican esa evolución que en el informe Bertelsmann aparece respecto de las democracias o algunas democracias y países que han dejado de serlo. La desinformación se beneficia de las redes sociales, del anonimato de las redes sociales, de las tecnologías digitales. Yo a veces he dicho, quizá un poco exageradamente, que las redes sociales son en algunos casos licencia para insultar, precisamente por ese anonimato en el que se mueven. Incluso podremos decir que hay ya creada una especie de industria de la desinformación. Hay una industria de la desinformación. Es decir, una acción mercenaria creada en favor de determinados grupos que desean la desinformación, que desean desinformar y que van a los expertos en desinformar. Es decir, a esos mercenarios, organizaciones privadas que van a esos expertos. Recientemente, esto no va precisamente a mencionar algo que tiene que ver con la actualidad, pero hay uno de esos industrias, le llamaban el Team George de Israel, que se dedicaban a facturar por labores de desinformación. O sea, la desinformación ya es una industria. Y esto es algo profundamente dañino para la democracia del siglo XXI, la democracia actual, y que, vuelvo a repetir, explica también algunas de las evoluciones que se reflejan en este importante informe que ha hecho la Fundación Bertelsmann. La más peligrosa de todas las desinformaciones es, sin duda, la que tiene una finalidad política. Esa es la más peligrosa. Por ejemplo, la que utiliza los regímenes ahora llamados regímenes iliberales. Este es el caso, por ejemplo, de Hungría o de otros países a los que se les denomina como regímenes iliberales, pero ha habido utilizaciones muy peligrosas con finalidad política de la desinformación, de todos conocidos, y que ha cambiado profundamente el escenario político. Por ejemplo, el Brexit. Es sabido que Johnson se valió de millones de datos suministrados por Facebook para poder inducir a la gente, a los británicos, que el Brexit era lo mejor que les podría pasar, que iba a mejorar sus vidas, que iba a ser magnífico. Y utilizó, por tanto, la técnica de esa desinformación en el caso conocido que se llamó el Cambridge Analytica, o el caso ahora está absolutamente de actualidad, el caso de Trump, la campaña que hizo Trump y que le permitió ganar. Bueno, que me permitió ganar por el sistema electoral norteamericano, porque la que ganó fue Hillary Clinton con 3 millones de votos más que Trump. Trump utilizó también millones de datos personales que le permitió reorientar en algunos escenarios políticos, en los llamados sobre todo swing states, aquellos que determinan al final la victoria en unas elecciones presidenciales en los Estados Unidos. Tenemos el caso de Rusia o de China. Rusia es un Estado desinformador, es un Estado que utiliza la desinformación como un arma política importantísima, y lo estamos viviendo en este momento, como es el caso de China también. El caso de China, que es un Estado también desinformador. Los efectos sobre la democracia son terribles de la desinformación, sobre todo la desinformación política. Por eso es por lo que en este caso tendríamos que hablar de antipolítica. Por eso es tan importante estos factores, estos elementos a los que yo me refería al definir la democracia en cuanto a la estructura de los partidos políticos o a los regímenes electorales, la pulcritud absoluta que deben tener esos regímenes para que puedan defenderse de estas acciones antidemocráticas al respecto. Yo diría, para terminar, que hay tres garantías que deberíamos poner en práctica para combatir la desinformación, que es un elemento más al que yo me he referido en estas palabras iniciales para hablar de la democracia y de los enemigos de la democracia. Uno es lo que podemos llamar la alfabetización mediática. La alfabetización mediática. Es muy importante esta cultura mediática para evitar que haya una desinformación que penetre subrepticiamente en las mentes de las gentes que luego van a ser electoras o electores. La segunda, que ya existe, con cierto éxito, que ya existe, es el caso de los llamados fact-checkers, es decir, las personas que controlan todo el tiempo qué información se da y denuncian aquellas informaciones que son informaciones no exactas y que, por tanto, forman parte de la desinformación. Con estas definiciones a las que yo me refería, conceptuales de la que hablaba la Comisión Europea y de la que hablaba también el Parlamento Europeo. Y luego también es importante, como una garantía contra la desinformación, es importante la colaboración de los high-tech. Las grandes empresas tecnológicas tienen que colaborar. Tienen que colaborar Meta, tienen que colaborar Amazon, tienen que colaborar Google. Estas grandes empresas tecnológicas tienen que colaborar para combatir la desinformación. Esos tres elementos, la alfabetización mediática, fact-checkers y colaboración de los high-tech, son, creo, elementos fundamentales para realmente combatir la desinformación. Creo que este es un buen momento para hablar de ello, para hablar de la democracia en su integridad para hablar de la necesidad de fortalecer esa democracia que se ha debilitado en el planeta en los últimos años, porque tenemos un año electoral por encima de todo. Estamos viviendo un superaño electoral, el año 2024. No solamente las elecciones al Parlamento Europeo y no solamente las elecciones que tenemos ahora en España, en el País Vasco y en Cataluña, sino en todo el mundo hay una coincidencia astral de que muchísimos procesos electorales se van a producir en 2024 y es un momento para defender la democracia precisamente en esos procesos. Nada más y muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, señor López Garrido. You've touched upon many different aspects of democracy. You've talked about political participation, populism, misinformation, and these and many other aspects will be now dealt with and presented by our colleagues Sabine Donner and Hauke Hartmann from the Bertelsmann Transformation Index. Sabine, you have the floor. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for this kind of introduction. And the enlightening food for thought that we heard already. Hauke and I are extremely honored and pleased to be here. And we are tremendously grateful to all of our colleagues at the Fundación and also to the Real Instituto Elcano for hosting this event. A big thank you to Clara, Vicente, Elisabeth. Your professionalism was very impressive and your hospitality humbled us. So thank you very much for having us. We will try to kick off the further debate with presenting the results of the BTI 2024. Since 2006, the Transformation Index has been analyzing 137 transformation countries according to 3 analytical dimensions. And I'm looking for my presenter here. Okay. The quality and status of democracy, the quality of economic development, and the quality of governance. Those analytical dimensions are extremely intertwined, and the BTI is a collaborative effort of more than 300 experts, country experts, researchers in more than 120 countries around the world. We will be presenting a lot of numbers here. The backbone of the BTI, though, are the roughly 7,000 pages of detailed country reports that contextualize each and every indicator that we are measuring, and they are trying to give a narrative of every country's unique path of transformation. So we don't come bearing terribly good news, actually, but what we are trying to do is showing you that there can be 2 things can be true. The sense of urgency felt by many people around the world to make democracy more resilient to authoritarian tendencies is warranted because there has been a decades-long global regression of political transformation of democracy that is very real and is happening. But also, on the other hand, another fact is true. Our findings also show that no trend is irreversible. There are promising signs and strategies on how to actually counter these autocratic tendencies. Like I said, we're looking at 3 dimensions, and all 3 dimensions that the BTI analyzes have hit rock bottom in the BTI 2024, with downward trends in political transformation and governance performance accelerating markedly since 2020. Never during the past 20 years has the average global status of democracy been so low. Consequently, the percentage of remaining democracies in the BTI is also the lowest ever. That's the picture of the 137 countries we observe according to their regimes, whether they're democracy or autocracy. And as you can see, with 46% of all countries analyzed, democracies clearly are in the minority. What has been driving this global recession, global regression, is a continuing erosion of core democratic institutions. The BTI defines a democracy not only by whether there are free and fair elections, but also by core political rights and political participation rights, association assembly rights, freedom of expression, separation of powers and civil rights. So the rule of law is very important for that categorization as well. In the last 2 years alone, elections in 25 countries have been less free and fair, while assembly and association rights in 32 countries have been increasingly curtailed, and the freedom of expression has faced tightened controls in 39 countries. At the same time, institutions established to control executive political power have been more and more undermined, and civil rights are less protected against state encroachment. We can identify 3 main phenomena that explain this trend if we are looking at the countries that we are analyzing. First, regime changes. Second, hardening autocracies, and democratic backsliding. Now, let's start with the first phenomenon. The first observation on regime changes sounds almost trivial. Of course, when the number of autocracies is rising, more regimes must have changed from democracy to autocracy than vice versa. Looking at all recorded regime changes in the BTI since 2006, this of course holds true. Additional, though, I want to point you to 2 more developments that become apparent. Between 2006 and 2020, regime changes to democratic or autocratic rule basically leveled themselves out. 23 democratic regime changes almost matched the 24 autocratic regime changes. During the last 4 years, though, since the BTI 2020, however, 14 autocratic regime changes clearly gained the upper hand compared to the 3 democratic regime changes that occurred in Honduras, Kenya, and Zambia. While some of these regime changes were the result of sudden military coups, others were caused by a more gradual decline, during which oversight institutions were undermined and political rights were abolished, such as in Benin, El Salvador, Tunisia, for example. Second observation is the majority of countries listed here experienced more than 1 regime change during the past 20 years and oscillated a couple of times between democracy and autocracies. The country's name appears in bold on that list at the regime category they currently hold. Over the past 20 years, only 3 countries where only 1 regime change occurred remained a democracy. But on the other hand, 15 countries who were experiencing 1 regime change to autocratic rule remained autocratic for now. That also points, of course, to hints at the fragility of new democracies, particularly when functioning democratic institutions had never been established in the past. A second phenomenon is the hardening of autocracies that has been driving the decline that I've been showing you when it comes to political transformation. Many autocracies have intensified their repression against political opposition, civil society, and the media. The space for an already, and I'm sort of showing you the 74 autocracies of the BTI now in purple. The space for an already limited political participation has been constantly shrinking. In all, among the 74 autocratic countries, 50, and those are marked in red, record the lowest level of political participation rights measured during the last 20 years. This autocratic hardening often occurred in reaction to mass protests against arbitrary rule, against economic hardship, against corruption or the gross violation of human and civil rights in cases like Algeria or Iran. The hardening happened after a military coup like in Mali, or like in Nicaragua after a longer continuous phase of democratic backsliding. This phenomenon of autocratic hardening has accelerated over the past decade. It appears that the overwhelming majority of dictatorships either are determined and able to consolidate their autocratic rule, or that they are forced to resort to ever more repressive methods to cling to power because the dissatisfaction and frustration of their citizens is showing more and more. So apparently, not only democracies are under stress. Which brings me to the third element of global political regression. This is the gradual backsliding of democracies. This might end in autocratic rule as in Turkey. It might severely limit the space for political competition as in Hungary or Serbia, or it might create intensified polarization and violence as in India and Mexico. This was democratic backsliding was one of the defining trends during the past 10 years. And we have already heard that Hungary provided an early blueprint on how to secure such an executive power grab, which is always a two-pronged approach. It aims to disable horizontal control mechanisms of power on the one hand, and it aims to silence critical voices on the other. This approach tends to get intensified. You start with violating judicial independence and end up with revising the constitution. You start with muzzling the media and restricting civil society activities and end up with manipulating elections. This is to say that the graduality of this backsliding sometimes makes it difficult to detect at first, and it's slowly progressing. BTI learnings inform us that all those examples of executive power grabs and democratic backsliding starts with a claim of deserving to rule more than others, as in India or South Africa, of ruling more efficiently than others, as in the cases of Benin or El Salvador, Tunisia, for example, or of being the true representatives of the people, as in Brazil or Hungary. All those claims are, in their nature, anti-pluralist, and its inherent polarization is the very starting point of executive power grabs. This polarization, though, needs to be perpetuated in order for those democracies to function, and those leadership styles. There is a great interrelatedness of that, of the decline of quality of democracy, though, with the governance performance and the leadership styles of those countries that I just mentioned. Thank you very much.
So this was only the first part, you know. First of all, thank you very much. Thank you very much for being so patient to do that all in English with us. I mean, you could have the hell of a time here and all talk in Spanish and would have fun and you know what, but you stay concentrated and you listen to our English presentations, and that I appreciate very much. Muchas gracias. Now, why should we even care when it comes to less democracies? Well, there's a normative reason for that, of course, and there's a human aspiration to be free, of course. But it's also a true and given fact that less democracy also means worse governance. And that, I think, is very, very important to highlight. And I would like to start with that. So the polarization that Sabine talked about leads to a declining willingness to build consensus. And that increases conflict within society. And one example here is Hindu nationalist governance. Executive power concentration and the personalization of decision-making reduces learning opportunities. So a government voluntarily gets dumber by centralizing powers and by shutting out critical opinions and expert knowledge. And this leads to flawed policies, as we could recently see in monetary politics, like in Turkey, for example. A dominant executive often considers power preservation as more important than improving societal development. So mismanagement and the subsequent reduction of living standards, they're not accidental, but they are systemic. Now, South Africa here is not really low on the scale, but also with a reduced score, and you could see that South Africa illustrates the dangers of blurring the line between governing party and the state. And that brings me to a more extreme example, and that is the dismantling of horizontal accountability, of oversight agencies, of transparency, encourage corruption and impunity for abuse of office. And so clientelism and informal power networks are the key pillars of party-state capture, as in Hungary. And then finally, inward confrontation goes hand in hand with outward confrontation. So the Mexican government, with all its domestic struggles, breaks several international agreements, workers' and migrants' rights, international climate agreements, or the Inter-American Democratic Charter. So these examples of governance portray governance regressing in democracy. However, you are already familiar with our color code. So blue means democracy, purple means autocracy. When you look at the distribution here, what you're seeing is that autocracies almost solely occupy the lower end of the governance scale. So of the 50 worst governance performers in the BTI 2024, 46 are autocracies. So a major BTI learning of the past 20 years is that for every well-run autocratic regime like Singapore, for example, there are at least 10 mismanaged regimes which are corrupt and run down. Democracies with all their flaws simply perform better. So I would like to pick up the cycle that Sabina already mentioned, and I would like to reverse this, because we have also seen some positive things. I would like to end the presentation of our global results with some positive news. And I would like to focus on democratic resilience and democratic resistance. Democratic resilience is apparent in countries like the Baltic states, Czechia, Slovenia, Chile, Costa Rica, Uruguay, as well as in Taiwan. They all have in common that they fortified their democratic institutions over the last 20 years, up to an extent of having absolutely consolidated democratic rule there. They have consistently done so, and they have done so with an amazingly strong rule of law. Resistance is exemplified by a democratic turnaround, which often happens via elections. In all of these countries listed here, the interaction between civil society and formal democratic institutions was of essence. So we learned that mobilization of civil society is key to protest against autocratization, against the dismantling of democracy. However, as we have tragically seen in countries like Algeria, Belarus, Iran, Myanmar, Sudan, this is not enough. Citizens must be linked up to political parties who can take their aspirations into the political arena. Ideally, this is a coordinated, programmatic, possibly bridge-building opposition, as we have seen recently in Poland or in Brazil. And it must support and at the same time benefit from the institutional resistance of constitutional courts or electoral authorities, and from journalists who address corruption and anti-democratic practices. So if all these forces combined like here, if they are able to come up with a networked approach of democratic resistance, they are likely to contribute to electoral victories of liberal political actors ready to push the democratic reset button. I cannot end this presentation being here, being in a country where Latin America matters, and matters more than in other countries, I would say. I would like to briefly touch upon our Latin America results, and more detail then in the ensuing following discussions with Carlos Malamud, to which Sabine and I are looking particularly forward. And first of all, it needs to be pointed out, and you do that in your report, of course, as well, that the political transformation status in Latin America and the Caribbean is quite advanced and second only to East Central and Southeast Europe. But however, as EU members like Hungary or until recently Poland have been considerably regressing, so have countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. You see the regression down there. That's really quite, for a 10-point scale, this is quite an amazing regression during the last 20 years. So with an average score of 6.24, the state of democracy in the region today is about on par with the current democracy status in Hungary or Indonesia. And that's quite sobering, I would say. But of course, this is all regional average. So let's take a closer look. So what we are seeing here is a north-south divide, really, between a north that is, let's say, system challenged, and a south which appears to be more or less democratically, I hesitate to say consolidated, but at least quite advanced. So Chile, Costa Rica, and Uruguay constitute stable, consolidated democracies. But the large majority of countries in the region consist of defective democracies. There are exceptions to the rule, like Brazil, but most of them, and I think that is important, show a large discrepancy between their participatory systems, which are well advanced, and the rule of law, which is less developed or destabilized. So there are opposing trends when you compare the BTI 2006 to the BTI 2024. Colombia, for example, stabilized their democratic institutions. There was a little rollback under Duque, but now under Petro it re-stabilized. Whereas at the same time, self-blockade, polarization, and corruption is challenging Peru. Lack of security is ever increasingly an issue, for example, in Ecuador and much of Central America. And there is a larger fluctuation, as you can see by comparing 2006 and 2024, between highly defective democracies and autocracies in Central America. El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua all have been affected in recent years, suffering from multiple instability factors like criminality, drugs, migration, privileged violence, and weak rule of law. Guatemala, after the end of our assessment period, so you still see Guatemala here as an autocracy, we didn't want to recolor it, but of course Guatemala made an impressive democratic comeback, as did Honduras, but need time and more stability to fortify democratic institutions. Because here's the other thing. Democratic institutions are fastly and more profoundly disabled under autocratic rule than they are rebuilt under democratic governance. So, for example, the rule of law score for Honduras is much less than it was in the times before autocratization. Still one level deeper. Let us have a look in what kind of indicators decreased or increased most during the last 20 years in Latin America. The repressive defense of status quo, or what Rachel Kleinfeld has called the privileged violence, same as executive aggrandizement, is blocking democratizations. Turnarounds are possible, as we've seen in Brazil, but nonetheless there are conscious efforts to dismantle rule of law. The rule of the judiciary is central in assessing Latin American democracies. It can stop authoritarian trends, as in Argentina, Brazil, and now Mexico, but it can also engage in lawfare to defend elite privileges against democratic hopefuls, as we have recently seen in Colombia or in Guatemala. So much of this explains the negative trends in separation of powers here. We also see another democratic core institutions, free and fair elections, which is also declining. That minus is predominantly driven by fortified autocratic rule in Nicaragua and Venezuela, and state dissolution in Haiti. And what we've seen is a failure of democratic governance to deliver ongoing corruption, persisting high inequality, elite power deals. They are an expression of a lack of commitment to democratic institutions and can lead to a reduction in approval of democracy. So one of the most pressing issues in this regard is, of course, security policies, and nowhere is this more visible than in El Salvador, where a hugely popular president dismantled the separation of power, brought the judiciary under control, and fights gang violence at the cost of massive human rights violations. This is representative of a special kind of executive power grab in which the executive promises to deliver faster and more efficiently if they are freed of democratic control mechanisms. The critique on democratic governance is not always fair, not always adequate. And you touched upon that earlier as far as fiscal stability is concerned, as far as the banking system in Latin America is concerned. So as you mentioned, we come to the very same results. Let me add social safety nets, and let me add anti-corruption policy. So there are a couple of things pretty high on the agenda of the Latin American populace, which governments actually do address. They show their responsiveness, but then again, some aspects like, as you see there, the level of socioeconomic development, they are not as easily changed. And so the disenchantment with the performance of democratic institutions brings about political actors of the extreme right, which promise to bring down the existing political system as a whole and radically alter its form, as seen successfully, formerly in Brazil, and most recently in Argentina. And this is a clear warning that if democracy does not deliver, then people are willing to get out their chainsaws. And this is indicated here by a waning consensus on goals and an increasing inability to provide for effective conflict management. So we might say that the current political polarization in Latin America is not only based on socio-economic conflicts, but also on social-cultural conflicts. The growing strength and influence of evangelist churches throughout Latin America, no interference of religious dogma, right on top, is a clear indicator for resistance against modernity and inclusion. And in that sense, one could sketch two different answers to political reform in Latin America as of today. One being more progressive, being more diversified and inclusive, like the one we are seeing again in Brazil, in Chile, in Colombia, always hampering itself with a fallback at times into clientelistic and identity politics, and a reactionary and exclusive one supported by evangelical churches and the extreme right. One final word. I was asked to also mention West and North Africa as a region of special importance to Spain, and I can make that very easy in pointing out two things when you compare the colorization. This is very obvious. During the last 4 years, we have seen that the last hope of the Arab Spring in North Africa has disappeared. In Tunisia, basically the same thing took place that also in El Salvador took place. Again, there was a president that dismantled the political system by claiming that he himself can be more effective. Whereas the very reason was that the legislative was not dominated, but very highly influenced by an Islamist party, and a lot of Tunisian civil society actors did not want an Islamist party to have a strong say, and preferred anti-democratic measures in dismantling Ennahda. That's one thing. The other thing is West Africa, and West Africa is really tragic. Like 4 years ago, our headline for the West Africa report was "Poor but Democratic." We had some good reasons. Togo and Mauritania were the only authoritarian countries left in West Africa. This has changed profoundly. This has changed via military coups. In Mali, in Burkina Faso, in Guinea, recently in Benin. Benin we still have in blue, that should be purple right now as well. So the remainders are really Ghana and Senegal and Gambia as strong democratic actors, and then as weaker democratic actors Liberia and Sierra Leone. This is, of course, happening in an environment that is extremely challenging for good governance, as polarization, militarization, Islamist insurgency, widespread poverty, and then climate change, they are, of course, posing a lot of challenges to democratic governance. I end here. I thank you for your patience, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
All the wealth of data you've given to us. Our colleagues will be putting some chairs to start the discussion with the authors, Hauke and Sabine, and with Carlos Malamud. Carlos is a historian, a political analyst. He's a main researcher at the Elcano Royal Institute, and he has published extensively on Latin America, on populism and the history of Latin America. So please, I'd like to call Carlos Malamud, Sabine Donner, and Hauke for the discussion. Come to the floor, please. Many thanks. We'll have time afterwards to have questions from the audience. We'll start with the debate. First of all, the director of Elcano Institute, Mr. Powell, mentioned about a report that you have at the Elcano Institute, Why Latin America Matters. And you've touched, he said that he agrees 90% of what's in the report. I'd like to ask you, Carlos, what's that 90% and what's the 10% that, well, you can't speak on behalf of Mr. Powell, but what are the main similarities and differences between the BTI 2024 and your report of Why Latin America Matters?
Well, I think, and I agree with Charles Powell in this point, that our report, Why Does Latin America Matter, and the BTA has some similar conclusions. We said that Latin America is the unique emerging region that tried to arrive to economic growth, to economic development, since democracy, since democratic institutions. And that Latin America, taking account of all emerging regions, is the most democratic region in the world, is the most respectful with the rule of law, with the liberties, with human rights. And the BTA said, well, in fact, Latin America is the second region in the world, taking in first place Eastern and Southeast Europe. But if we take account that these two parts of Europe are not emerging regions, the conclusion is the same.
Mm-hmm. Right.
That, and we could also, if you remember the world map, most of Latin America is painted in blue. Perhaps different gradations of blue, but it's painted in blue. And also, the BTA speak about the resilience of democratic regimes in Latin America and the resilience of defective democracies in Latin America. It's interesting because we could see in the mapping page 10 of the Transformation Index that there are 15 democracies in consolidation in the world, and 5 of them are from Latin America.
Yep.
They are 8 defective democracies and 8 in Latin America, and 11 highly defective democracies, 3 in Latin America. So, if you take account of all these blue democracies, 25%, more than 25%, are placed in Latin America. So I think we have there a big coincidence between our report, Why Does Latin America Matter? And the BTA 2024. And regarding the 10%, I don't know exactly, but of course, well, as Charles said, we are perhaps, we rode with a big touch of optimism.
And I could also say, I mean, BTI published today did not include Guatemala, did not include Brazil. Our results would be more positive and probably closer to yours.
Yes, because Guatemala is a big turning point in the region, is a clear evidence of resilience and a clear evidence of how some countries could return to the path of democracy. That the way to populism could be reversed and not in one direction.
Would you like to elaborate, Sabine, on or Hauke on this, or more on?
I just wanted to chime in as far as Guatemala is concerned,
Yeah.
because I thought Guatemala heartwarming, impressive, and everything. I mean, the self-mobilization of indigenous populations that are out there to claim, to protest against the decision-making of the judiciary, of an apparently power-prone, corrupt judiciary, was super impressive and shows the potential that civil society protests had, as we headlined out in the global results as well, shows the potential that civil society protest has if they can link up to the existing system. And somehow they managed to do so.
And it is necessary to take account that Guatemala was ruled in the last years by a gang called Pact of Corrupts, Pacto de los Corruptos,
Yeah.
that is a combination of politicians, entrepreneurs, judges, members of the police and of the army. And when Mr. Alvarado, an unexpected runner for the presidency, win, well, it seems that the war is arriving to the end. And everybody, everything is allowed to put an end to this unexpected fact that is the victory of Mr. Alvarado. And at the end, with a combination of internal factors that are essential and key, and also the combination of international pressures, not only from the United States, but basically from the United States, also from the European Union, things could reverse, and Mr. Alvarado finally, like an opera soap performing, could take power and place in office.
Right. You talked about populism. Mr. López Garrido before talked extensively about populism as an important element to be fought against. Is it still as it used to be, or it was considered to be a typical Latin American element, or has it extended all over the world? Maybe you could both, from your report and also from the BTI, you could elaborate on this.
It's true that in the 30s, 40s, and 50s of the 20th century, populism was a clear Latin American phenomenon. There is Peronism, Vargism, Cardenism. They are typically from Latin America. Then we have a new wave of populism, the so-called neoliberal populism, with Menem, Bucaram, and others, Fujimori in Peru. Later on, in the first decade of the 21st century, we have the Bolivarian populism. And since then, there are some kind of homogeneity between all these populist experience. But now we could see that populism is spread about all the political and ideological spectrum. Since left to right, we could see right populism, left populist, above populist, below populist, center populist. Recently, a journalist spoke about Javier Milei, the new president of Argentina, and qualifying him, he said, Mr. Milei is a right populist. And he take like a big offense and said, well, this journalist is an idiot. Mr. Pérez Reverte, that is a close friend from this journalist, said, well, the idiot is Milei, etc., etc., etc. But the question is that we have in Latin America populists from the right, Mr. Bukele is there, Mr. Milei also. We have populists from the left, or the so-called left, López Obrador, for example, Daniel Ortega, I don't know if he's still a leftist man or what he is. Well, we could say that there are a matrimonial engagement in the government between Mr. Ortega and his wife, Rosario Murillo. But we could see now that, and the BTI also corroborates this idea, that today populism isn't a Latin America phenomenon. We had Donald Trump in the United States. We could have now another time next November. We have Mr. Boris Johnson in UK and the Brexit phenomenon. We have Mr. Orbán in Hungary and Kaczynski brothers in Poland. There are examples for near our wall. And of course, we have another cases of populism in Asia and Africa and elsewhere. So isn't more a phenomenon from Latin America.
And it has been, I guess, in your report, Sabine and Hauke, it has been confirmed that that is the case, that populism is an overall trend, not only in the Latin American results, but also in the rest of the wider world. I assume from the report, from the data that you just showed us. Yeah.
The thing is, I agree with everything you said. So the choice of countries is perfect.
You could disagree.
No. The point is, populism has started to get such a catch-all label. If it is a top-down movement, if it is anti-pluralist, if there is a polarization of society, we the people against a small elite, then we talk about populism. And all the examples you mentioned portray exactly that. But there are a lot more political regressions that we are witnessing that have not a lot to do with populism, that are pure and simple, as you explained in the earlier slides, executive power grabs. People who simply want to solidify their power. And so I'm saying that because in German media, we even have such a boring party than the AfD, the extreme right, being labeled as a populist party, and I'm thinking they're far too boring to be populist. But no, they are just pure and simple right. This is a right-wing party. And that's it. I do not need the label populist in order to make them even worse. That's the only addition that I wanted to say that changes nothing. It was a US-American phenomenon, populism, that went to Latin America ages ago. And I do not see populism that much in other parts of the world, actually, apart from Europe. In Europe, yes, there is a little bit of populism in Zambia, perhaps, but
No, but it's true that you are saying, because in Latin America there are a presence of a strong anger vote, a vote anti-incumbent. If we take apart the result of the El Salvador elections, where Mr. Bukele was re-elected, in the last 17 presidential elections held in Latin America, in 15, the opposition's party won. Only in Nicaragua, applying non-democratic methods, and Paraguay, where the Colorado Party is a strong clientelistic party with very strong regional roots. In the rest, opposition parties win, because there are a very strong sensation of frustration between the citizens against the results of public policies applied by inefficient governments and corrupt politics. And this anger, for example, explains why a politician like Javier Milei, with a very special characteristics, could be elected president of Argentina. Only taking account of this sensation of frustrations between the citizens, we could explain why Milei is in office now.
Absolutely.
And not only this, also the strong support of public opinion instead the tough adjustment policy that is applying Mr. Milei to contain inflation and to put economy in order again.
But just to add, maybe we could say that almost all anti-democratic actors are using populist rhetoric and instruments, tactics these days. Even, you know, in military coups, the military says this is to end that corrupt, decadent rule of the old elite who is betraying you, etc., etc. That doesn't make them populists.
Yeah,
but you know, the application of the tactics and rhetoric seems to work in many countries.
The question is that populism is a polyvalent definition. In fact, in social science, we have two concepts. One is terrorism and another is populism that have many, many definitions. Right. And it's impossible to reach an agreement between social scientists of what is populism, what is terrorism, and right. So on. No? Yeah. Recently, we have elections in the Basque Country, and the candidate of the former Batasuna don't want to define the ETA terrorist movement as terrorist. I say, well, it doesn't matter who is. But the question is, we could define some main characteristics of populism. For example, the bypassing of political parties and the direct contact between the leader and the masses. The minusvaloration of the judiciary, for example. The existence of a caudillo, a very empathetic and charismatic leader. But at the end of the day, it's very difficult to define what populism is.
Maybe as a last question before we take questions from the floor, Your report, the BTI report, is illuminating because since 2006 you've been measuring, so it's a longitudinal report, which is very useful for, as our director Basolza said before, because it's very useful to ministries, to organizations, etc., because it gives you, as I said, a longitudinal analysis of what's going on. Are you able to say that we are facing a new trend? Can we speak of waves, tides, trends, Zeitenwende, as Mr. Scholz said? Are we facing a new change of order because of the results that you just showed, given this almost 2 decades of analyzing almost the same countries and the same indicators? Are we facing a new tide of, or a new era? It's a broad question, I know, but
I'm hesitant to characterize something as a tide or wave while it is still happening, and I mean this is useful as an analytical exercise. I know that some of our colleagues who are doing indices are talking about the third wave of autocratization, etc., etc. The risk of defining this and grouping this is that we are losing focus where the differences are. You know, if I'm talking about a wave of autocratization, like we try to show, there are differences whether we are talking about democracies or whether we're talking about hardening autocracies, etc. The same holds true for world regions. So I'm hesitant to say we are in some sort of tides and waves, although life teaches me that, yes, there are déjà vus and there are similarities of other phenomena in the past that we should look at. I would find it more interesting to focus on what we can learn from, for example, Latin American resilient democracies and turnarounds. Is there something that can be applied in other world regions for countries that are struggling?
would you like to comment, elaborate on what Sabine just said?
I would simply add, but in the very same vein, that at least in the countries where there still is a jury, the jury is still out. Meaning that there are so many hopeful signs of reversal of authoritarian trends. Most recent, take the municipal elections in Turkey, for example. So unexpected opposition victories. I think we only come to understand right now how to counter the very different entry points for subversion, authoritarian subversion, with democratic countermeasures. So in the very same vein, I would also say, okay, how can we help Ecuador, or what can Ecuador learn not to go the same pathway as Peru? Or what can Ecuador learn to go a pathway that is more resembling Colombia, for example? That, I think, would be a very, very interesting learning experiment. But I do believe it is about high time that democracies do speak with each other and start their learning curve, because autocracies are learning from each other. And so I think what you are recommending in why Latin America matters, and that is that democratic regions learn from each other. I think that would be penultimate in a situation like that.
Yes, and also authoritarian regimes and authoritarian policies spread very fast.
Yeah.
For example, the Bukele models is trying to be adopted in other Latin American
Honduras,
countries.
yeah.
Not only in the right side, but also in the left side. Honduras, for example, is a clear example of how quickly these authoritarian models and authoritarian policies could be spread regionally and internationally also.
Yeah.
And as you said in your presentation, the reverse of a democratic institution is very hard. It could be easy to destroy it than to rebuild.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you. Now I'd like to open the floor to 2 to 3 questions. If I can see any interest in questioning. We have one here, another one there. Yeah, so we'll start. Could you present yourself, please?
Hello, thank you. My name is Bernardo Navasso, and I work as a consultant related to geopolitical affairs. So basically, one of the questions that normally we are asked about the future of democracy is something that we normally tend to listen. So thank you very much, because I think that the presentation we haven't had, and I haven't had the opportunity to read the report, but it seems extremely thorough. And I really like that you are addressing like super interesting questions related to social output. In the sense that, and this is the question, and I also want to know a little bit about the trend that Vicente was mentioning earlier. So if we just say, for example, that democracy, we take aside the normative question, and we say that it's just only like a social system, a social way of getting organized in our societies that provide for certain social outputs. And now we're seeing that this social system is being challenged by other different competitors, like, for example, the China model. They could say that could be like digital, techno surveillance capitalism, or whatever we name it. Is this idea about, have you found, because you present the social outputs and you say policy convergency or policy regulation or the ability to get consensus on goals. And it seems, when we look at the slide, that every single autocratic government, or that what we deem autocratic, is placed below, the red is under like the minimum score. And it seems to us like very obvious at the same, when we look at first sight, that autocracies are not being able to provide social output. But at the very same time, they are like getting some kind of recognition. We know since 2010 that, like these countries that were developing countries, now we are not looking at how we organize our capital markets. They are not looking at how we organize our institutions. And they're also looking for other different kind of factors, like, for example, China, looking at the model. So we are seeing that geopolitically, the fact that China is starting to show there is a different way. We know that these developing countries in 2010 and afterwards were not looking for that kind of, for our, our guidance, and they started to looking for other different models. And at the very same time, that doesn't match up with your data, in the sense that you still show that they are not able to provide the social output that they are aspiring to. So I'm trying to reconcile these two theses, and I wonder what you think about this, because I think that this is like the most important question now we are looking at the Western. There is an alternative model that is offering social outputs that is like kind of like working in the sense that is providing political stability, and we are competing against that.
Any intake? Anybody want to take the lead on this?
I'm not sure if I understood the question correctly, but yes, there is an alternative model, has been probably, well, throughout times, but the success of that model, if you're referring to China, is mainly China. I mean, and even then, it's still out there. If you're looking at the output of social provisions, social development for people, there are not many autocracies that we are looking at that show the same sort of outputs. We can reduce that to Singapore, China, well, although lagging in the past couple of years, maybe Rwanda in Africa, although it's heavily deputed, how deeply ingrained the social change is. So the facts and numbers when you're looking at socioeconomic output of autocracies is pretty much and heavily in favor of democracies performing better. That is not to say that it doesn't work, but I think and someone told that to me from Africa, actually. Many of the African rulers who want to keep in power are actually following an alternative model to keep power. That's more of the Russian version, which is not socioeconomically that successful, but it keeps you in power. And not many are aiming to achieve, social progress for all people. They're pointing more or less to democracies not delivering, which is true in many instances as well. But we don't have that many, if at all, tremendously successful example of authoritarian socioeconomic output that would be convincing and sustainable.
Yeah. Can I quickly link
sure.
link up to that, because
Yeah, we have two more, but,
I think
go ahead.
the point is very powerful to think about what actually happened to China. I mean, China is a success model in development and brought hundreds of millions out of poverty, and that's an achievement. And we definitely do not deny that. What happened during the last the point only was the reason behind that China was an autocracy. Was that the main driver of that development? And when I look at that, I would say, no, that was Deng Xiaoping's openness to experiment and to let creative forces in society loose under an authoritarian umbrella, but still. And what we are seeing in Naxi is actually a backpedaling and a row of strategic mistakes that can only happen because the very strength of Chinese development, and that is a meritocratic system, not one based on loyalty, but on meritocracy, that is older than the Communist Party of China in China, and the experimentalism under Deng Xiaoping, they were taken back, and now Xi is surrounded by loyalists that do not inform him about the public. About the real estate crisis, about the failing zero-COVID strategy, and so on. So there's one strategic blunder after the other. And that reason for that is autocratic, because the narrower the group of people you decide with, the dumber you actually get. And as Sabina, I hope we get to the core of your question.
Thank you. We have another question back there, yeah, on the third row. Yeah, thank you.
Hello, thank you very much. My name is Carlo. I come from an association called Voces Libres. I wanted to ask you about, in the same way we have economic cycles, can we consider these as political cycles? Because, for example, when we created Europe, we thought of a concept of democracy that was going to be long-lasting forever, and now we've seen just the case of Brexit or Hungary, Poland, and of course this makes us question what we understood about our liberal democratic system. And then also, for example, bringing the case to democracy in Spain, we had, for example, I think the creation of right-wing party Vox can be a consequence of left-wing party Podemos. So in the end, is there a sort of cycle or linkage between these populist or extreme parties? Thank you very much.
You take that.
Not me, so it's the three of you, so I'm safe.
No, I don't think so. The emergency of Podemos or Vox is consequence of a political cycle. It has more deep roots, for example, in the fragmentation of the bi-party system, that is very important. Of course, there are some responses, some answers to some defies. For example, the process, the Catalonia intend to call a referendum and be an independent country, provokes a very strong reaction in Spanish nationalism. But I don't think so you could define this like a cycle. Our defies answers but not cycles. I don't believe in cycles in history. Our open process and processing work.
I mean, on a sorry.
Go ahead.
No, just on a global level, I think what we have realized now, also in Western democracies, is that this is not a, you establish a democratic system, then you wait and see what happens, but you have to protect it and actually adapt to new circumstances every time. And I think we are in the middle of trying to find answers to that. So if we're talking about that democratic resilience that we're mentioning so often, yes, it's withstanding authoritarian trends, but I think it's also reinvigorating and adapting the system that we invented, depending on the countries ages ago, to new circumstances. And that will be so that we are on a solid foundation again. And this is a perpetual thing to do, I think, and not based on a cycle where, we're going from one crisis to the next and hoping that, the system doesn't crash. We have to reinvent and strengthen the system, I think, to make it adaptable to what challenges are out there.
The idea of cycle is like the idea of rotation, of revolution. One of the acceptions of revolution is the astronomical one. All the orbit around the axis of a planet or a body. So the revolution is the returning to the starting point, and it's not your idea of cycle.
Thank you. We have the last question here up front. Yep. Thank you.
Thank you, and congratulations for the report. This is very interesting. My name is Pepe Fernández Albertos. I come from the Prime Minister Office, the political for the policy planning department. So my question is about the relationship between. So when I was in grad school, the main determinant of political regimes to be studied was economic growth. And was growth related to democracies, or was the other way around? And I wouldn't say that was the final word on the subject, but the most, I think, the convincing story was that democracies were more resilient to economic crisis, and that's why, whereas dictatorships were very fragile under economic stress. And that's why over time, as soon as economic cycles were up and down, we would see more democracies as long as growth was going up. And in the period that you're analyzing, you just started working this work, even if there is no, of course, there was the secular stagnation and the crisis, the financial crisis, but the countries that you're looking at experienced overall significant amount of growth. And yet you find this regression to more autocratic forms of governance. So that's sort of striking, given the long-standing sort of assumptions under that framework. So what has changed according to, and you have, my suggestion is that you have a lot of data, you have this data on economic governance, so are countries that are well governed, even though they are autocratic, more resilient or less resilient, and I think there's a lot of ways in which you can explore your data, or many people can explore your data to find answers to these questions. But my general question is it that in this period, because of these populism trends or these new ways of governments to stay in power through these power grabs, tools that didn't exist before, is it that autocracies are more resilient today to economic crisis than they were in the past? That's one possibility. Or is it that democracies are more fragile than they were? So relatively rich democracies are now more fragile than they were in the past? Or is it both?
First of all, I would certainly agree that there are socio-economic circumstances in which it is much more difficult to establish a democracy. That's a starter. That West Africa was predominantly democratic 4 years ago speaks for the participatory impulse of the populations there, but again is highly unlikely. I would go along that much. Are democracies more fragile than autocracies? I think not. I think what we have seen during the last 4 years is actually a time lag. There were massive crises induced probably first by the rapid decline of raw material prices during the second half of the 2010s, then picked up by the pandemic, then picked up by the post-pandemic inflation, then strengthened by increased inflation after the Russian invasion in Ukraine. So there were a couple of economic disasters in a row that were having a manifest effect on the economic fabric of a lot of countries. That dissatisfaction with the ongoing state of affairs manifested itself quicker in democracies. Why? Because they have an outlet. You can vote bad crisis managers out, and you can deplorably pick bad candidates to vote them out. So what we had seen between the BTI 2020 and 2022 was a regression of a couple of democracies. What we're seeing in this BTI, as Sabine explained at the very outset, is that we see hardening autocracies. And that's the main driver of political regression right now, meaning the crisis has arrived at autocratic regimes. They do not have the input legitimacy of having a mandate through elections, so they need to justify their rule by output legitimacy, and they do not have it, or most of them do not have it, because 9 out of 10 autocracies are simply run down. And so I would say that autocracies in their very vast majority are in a very weak position right now, feeling that and turning the repressive screw. And so that is a counter-reaction that is scary, of course, but it is a show of weakness, I would say.
Many thanks. I think we would leave it here. Just to summarize, almost 300 experts working in 120 countries, if I'm not mistaken, measuring 137 countries in the world, and every 2 years publishing this amazing report since 2006. It's thought-provoking, it's full of data. I'd like to say vielen danke, thank you very much. And also thank you, Mr. López Garrido, for your illuminating keynote speech to Instituto Elcano, Carlos Malamud, and also our technicians, and Mamen Taibo también from the Instituto Elcano. And we have a small cocktail on behalf of the Bertelsmann and Elcano Institute waiting for us outside. Thank you very much.
Thank you.